My name is Sophia Brown. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've volunteered every Friday evening at a hospice care center in Millbrook, sitting with terminally ill patients who have no family left to visit them. A commitment I built quietly around my actual career as a senior underwriter at a regional insurance firm. That's the credibility. Here's the part that still doesn't sit right in my chest. My entire family assumed I was lonely and broke, spending Friday nights alone in my apartment, because not one of them ever once asked where I actually went. I want to tell you exactly what my mother said to me at Easter dinner this year because I've replayed it every day since. She reached across the table, patted my hand the way you might comfort a child, and said, in front of my brother, my sister-in-law, and both of my nieces, "It's okay, Sophia. Not everyone finds their person right away. At least you have your little Friday routine to keep busy." My little Friday routine, that's what 6 years of sitting beside dying strangers, holding their hands through their final months, so they wouldn't have to face it completely alone, had been reduced to in my own family's imagination. But here's what my mother didn't know yet, patting my hand across that dinner table. 3 months earlier, the hospice center had quietly nominated me for a regional volunteer recognition award, and 2 weeks after that Easter dinner, I would be standing at a podium in a hotel ballroom in Columbus, accepting that award in front of 300 people, while my family sat at home believing I was, as my mother put it, still working on my little Friday routine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all really started. If you're watching this tonight and something about it already feels a little too familiar, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. I read every single comment. I grew up in a large, boisterous family outside Toledo, Ohio, the youngest of 3 children and the only daughter. My older brothers, Marcus and Ethan, were athletic, loud, and endlessly celebrated for every small accomplishment. A decent report card, a soccer goal, eventually their careers and their marriages. Family dinners revolved naturally around whichever brother had recently won a game, gotten a promotion, or announced a new milestone in his relationship. The conversation flowing easily around topics everyone already knew how to discuss. I was the quiet one, the bookish one, the one who preferred reading in my room to family gatherings that always seemed to orbit around whichever brother had the most recent news to share. My mother, in particular, developed a narrative about me early on that never seemed to update itself as I got older. Sophia is shy. Sophia keeps to herself. Sophia will find her way eventually, once she comes out of her shell. The truth was considerably more complicated than that narrative allowed for. I wasn't shy so much as observant, and I wasn't friendless so much as selective about where I spent my limited emotional energy. I had a small, tight circle of close friends throughout school, people who knew me far better than my own family seemed to. But once a family decides on your story, correcting it becomes an uphill battle nobody in the family particularly wants to fight. Least of all you, since fighting it just confirms, in their minds, that you're sensitive about being called shy, proving their own narrative right in the process of trying to disprove it. I earned my degree in risk management from Ohio State in 2013, working 2 part-time jobs to cover the gap my scholarship didn't reach, one at a campus bookstore and another tutoring statistics for underclassmen, and started as a junior underwriter at Meridian Insurance the same year I graduated. My brothers, meanwhile, had both married by their mid-20s, and family gatherings increasingly became about grandchildren, soccer schedules, and anniversary celebrations, each milestone marked with genuine enthusiasm and detailed follow-up questions at every subsequent dinner. My own milestones: a promotion to senior underwriter in 2018, a specialized certification in catastrophic risk modeling in 2020, eventually managing a portfolio worth $340 million in commercial policies, covering everything from manufacturing plants to shipping fleets, registered at family dinners as polite, brief nods before the conversation swung back to safer, more familiar territory involving my niece's school plays and my nephew's Little League standings. The Friday routine started 6 years ago, almost by accident. A coworker's mother had been receiving hospice care, and I'd driven her there one Friday evening when her own car broke down, sitting in the waiting room for 2 hours while she visited. Something about that quiet, dim-lit facility, the particular hush of people at the end of their lives, moved me in a way I hadn't expected. I started volunteering the following month, initially just reading to patients or helping with small tasks, and within a year, I was assigned specifically to patients without family visitors, the no-visitor list, as the staff quietly called it, people who would otherwise spend their final weeks completely alone. I never told my family what I actually did on Friday evenings. Partly at first because it felt private, almost sacred, not something I wanted turned into casual dinner conversation fodder. But over time, the silence calcified into habit, the same way so many things about my life had simply stopped being discussed once my family decided I didn't have much worth discussing. When my mother would ask vaguely, "What did you get up to this weekend?" I'd say something non-committal like not much. Just a quiet Friday, technically true, and also nowhere close to the actual truth. If any part of this is landing close to home for you, go ahead and drop a comment. I read every single one. Over 6 years, I sat with 11 different patients through the final months of their lives, most of them elderly, several with no children, a few outlived by children who simply never visited, for reasons ranging from estrangement to distance to what I suspect was, in some cases, an inability to face watching a parent die. I learned their stories. A retired schoolteacher named Walter who taught in the same building for 31 years and never married, filling his final weeks with stories about former students he's still remembered by name decades later. A woman named Ruth who'd emigrated from Poland after the war and outlived 2 husbands, teaching me small phrases in Polish between our conversations about her childhood. A Korean War veteran named Douglas who told me, in his final coherent week, that I was the only person who ever asked him what the war actually felt like, rather than just what happened. A distinction he clearly considered important enough to mention twice. I held Walter's hand when he passed in his sleep on a Friday evening 2 years ago, staying past visiting hours because the staff knew, by then, that I wasn't going anywhere, sitting with him until the funeral home arrived at nearly midnight. Me by her sister's name, Anya, and I answered to it without correction, because it seemed to bring her comfort, and comfort at that stage mattered infinitely more than accuracy. I never mentioned any of this at family dinners. Not because I was hiding some scandal, but because my family's established narrative about me had never once left room for the possibility that my Friday evenings might contain something meaningful, something that required real emotional labor and genuine presence, rather than simply filling empty hours. There were harder patients too, ones I don't discuss as easily even now. A man named Robert who spent most of our visits angry, at his diagnosis, at his estranged son who never called, occasionally at me for reasons that had nothing to do with anything I'd done. And I learned, slowly, that sitting with someone's anger without needing to fix it was its own particular skill. One nobody in my family had ever needed to teach me because nobody in my family had ever really needed me to develop it before. Robert passed on a Wednesday, not a Friday, and Carol called to let me know, thinking I'd want to hear it from someone rather than finding out through the facility's routine notifications. I sat in my car in the Meridian Insurance parking lot for 10 minutes that afternoon, grieving a man most of my own family had never heard of and never would. There was also a woman named Beatrice in the second year of my volunteering, whose dementia had progressed to the point where she believed, most Fridays, that I was her daughter Carol, come to visit after years of estrangement neither of us ever fully understood the origin of. I played that role for her every week for 4 months, listening to stories about a childhood I'd never actually lived, apologizing for absences I'd never actually caused, because correcting her only ever produced confusion and distress, while accepting the role she needed me to play produced something that looked remarkably like peace. I never told my own mother about Beatrice, mostly because I couldn't imagine finding language that would make her understand why I'd spent 4 months answering to a stranger's daughter's name without ever once feeling like I was losing something of my own identity in the process. The nomination for the Regional Volunteer Recognition Award came from the Hospice Center's director, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who submitted my name to the state's Hospice Association without telling me until after the nomination had already been accepted for review. She called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon in February, told me the news, and said, plainly, "Sophia, in 15 years running this facility, I have never seen a volunteer as consistent, as genuinely present, as you've been for these patients. This recognition is long overdue." I cried in her office, partly from the honor itself, and partly, I think, from the strange grief of realizing how starved I'd been for exactly that kind of acknowledgement, the kind my own family had simply never thought to offer. Easter fell 2 weeks before the award ceremony, and I almost mentioned it at dinner, almost let the news slip out over the ham and scalloped potatoes. But then my mother made her comment about my little Friday routine, delivered with such casual, well-meaning condescension, and something in me quietly decided not to give her the satisfaction of correcting the narrative just yet. I wanted, I think, to see what would happen if the truth simply announced itself later, on its own terms, rather than being offered up defensively at a dinner table, where it would likely be met with polite disbelief anyway. The ceremony took place at a hotel ballroom in downtown Columbus. 300 attendees, mostly hospice professionals, volunteers, and families of patients who'd wanted to honor the people who'd sat with their loved ones at the end. I invited no one from my family, partly out of habit, partly, honestly, out of a quiet desire to have this one thing be entirely, completely mine. Carol introduced me from the podium, sharing details about Walter and Ruth and Douglas that I hadn't realized she'd learned from the staff notes over the years, and by the time I reached the microphone myself, I was fighting back tears in front of 300 strangers who understood, in a way my own family never quite had, exactly what 6 years of Friday evenings actually meant. I gave a short acceptance speech about the dignity of being witnessed at the end of a life, about how loneliness in someone's final months is its own particular kind of tragedy, one that a few consistent hours a week can genuinely soften. I talked about Douglas specifically, about how a simple question, "What did the war actually feel like?" had opened up conversations he'd apparently been waiting decades for someone to invite, and about how so much of hospice volunteering wasn't really about grand gestures, but about the accumulation of small, consistent attention that most people, including my own family, rarely think to offer anyone, dying or otherwise. I received a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute, longer than I expected, longer certainly than any acknowledgement I'd received at a family gathering and longer than I could remember, and I stood at that podium for a moment afterward, letting the applause wash over me, thinking about how strange it was that a room full of strangers understood something about my life that my own family had never bothered to ask about. A cousin of mine, Diane, happened to be at that ceremony representing her own hospice volunteer work in a neighboring county, and she recognized me immediately, snapping a photo of me at the podium and posting it, unprompted, to the family group chat with the caption, "So proud of Sophia, Regional Volunteer of the Year." The responses trickled in over the following hour, a slow-motion collision between my family's assumptions and the reality they'd never bothered to investigate. My brother Marcus responded first, oddly, with a simple "wait what?" followed by a string of confused emoji from Ethan's wife. My mother's response came nearly 90 minutes later. "Wait, what is this? What award?" I called her the next morning and told her everything, calmly, without the satisfaction I might have expected to feel finally correcting 6 years of casual dismissal. I told her about Walter and Ruth and Douglas, about the no-visitor list, about the specific Friday 6 years ago when a coworker's broken-down car had accidentally introduced me to work that had become one of the most meaningful parts of my life. I told her about the standing ovation, about Carol's introduction, about details of the ceremony she would have known already if she'd simply asked one genuine question over the past 6 years. My mother was quiet for a long stretch on the phone, and then she said, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in years, "I had no idea. I just assumed you were home alone, and I felt bad for you, so I never asked more, because I didn't want to make you feel worse about it." I told her, honestly, that her assumption had never actually been about protecting my feelings. It had been about a story she'd decided about me in childhood that she'd simply never bothered to update. The same story that let her pat my hand at Easter dinner instead of asking a single genuine question about my actual life. The same story that made "not everyone finds their person right away" feel like an appropriate thing to say to a woman who'd spent 6 years holding strangers' hands through the end of their lives. She didn't argue with that. She sat with it. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard something in her voice that sounded like real reflection rather than reflexive reassurance. Things have shifted somewhat since that phone call. My mother asked, a few weeks later, if she could come with me one Friday evening, not to visit patients herself, but simply to understand what the work actually looked like. I said yes, cautiously, and she sat quietly in the family waiting area for 2 hours while I visited with a current patient, a widower named Frank, before we drove home mostly in silence, my mother clearly processing something she hadn't expected to feel. She's asked more questions since then, real ones, about specific patients, about what drew me to this work in the first place, questions 6 years overdue but genuine nonetheless. She even brought up Walter by name at a recent dinner, asking gently what he'd been like, and something in me softened at hearing his name spoken at that table where he'd never once been mentioned before. My brothers have been slower to adjust, still occasionally slipping into old habits at family dinners, redirecting conversation back to their children's achievements before I've finished a sentence. Marcus, in particular, seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the whole situation, perhaps recognizing something uncomfortable about his own role in 6 years of casual dismissal, and has mostly dealt with that discomfort by avoiding the topic entirely rather than engaging with it directly. Ethan, to his credit, called me a week after the ceremony to apologize more directly, admitting he'd always assumed my quietness meant I didn't have much going on worth asking about, an assumption he said he felt genuinely embarrassed by once he understood what I'd actually been doing every Friday for 6 years. But my niece Emma, 13 years old and apparently more perceptive than the adults in our family, asked me directly at a recent gathering, "Aunt Sophia, can I come with you sometime, when I'm old enough? I want to understand what you do." I told her I'd be honored to bring her along someday, once she was old enough for the facility's visitor policy to allow it, and something about her simple, uncomplicated curiosity felt like the truest form of acknowledgement I'd received from my family in years, uncomplicated by decades of assumptions or defensive backpedaling. I still go every Friday. Frank is doing better than expected, all things considered, and we've started playing chess during our visits, though he insists on narrating his strategy out loud in a way that makes it fairly easy for me to anticipate his moves. He was a mechanical engineer for 30 years, and something about the precision of chess seems to give him a sense of control that his failing health increasingly takes away elsewhere. So I let him win about a third of the time, not obviously enough to insult him, but enough, I hope, to give those Friday afternoons a little extra light. The work hasn't changed because my family finally noticed it. If anything, I've realized sitting with these patients was never actually about needing anyone's recognition in the first place. It simply took an award ceremony and a group chat photo from my own family to finally catch up to something that had been true, quietly and steadily, the entire time. Carol has already mentioned nominating me again next year, an idea I've asked her, gently, to reconsider, since the actual work matters far more to me than any repeat recognition ever could. I think sometimes about how easily that entire truth could have stayed hidden, if Diane hadn't happened to attend that ceremony, if she hadn't recognized me and posted that photo without asking. There's a strange kind of gratitude I feel toward that accident of timing now, not because I needed the recognition to validate the work itself, but because it finally forced a conversation my family and I had been avoiding in different ways for 6 quiet years. Some truths I've learned don't need to be defended or explained. They simply need enough time and enough consistency to eventually become undeniable, whether or not anyone was paying attention while it happened. Here's what I want you to take away from tonight. In my own words, because I've earned the right to say this plainly after 6 years of quiet, unacknowledged devotion to people who had absolutely no one else. Being underestimated by your own family often has less to do with who you actually are, and more to do with the story they decided about you before you had any say in the matter. You are allowed to build a meaningful life in the spaces your family never bothered to look. You are allowed to let the truth speak for itself in its own time on a stage they never expected you to stand on. I think sometimes about how easily that entire truth could have stayed hidden if Diane hadn't happened to attend that ceremony, if she hadn't recognized me and posted that photo without asking. There's a strange kind of gratitude I feel toward that accident of timing now. Not because I needed the recognition to validate the work itself, but because it finally forced a conversation my family and I had been avoiding, in different ways, for 6 quiet years. Some truths, I've learned, don't need to be defended or explained. They simply need enough time and enough consistency to eventually become undeniable, whether or not anyone was paying attention while it happened. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which part hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.